LLC from transvoicelessons.com, and in this video I want to look at the big picture of trans voice. I want to zoom way out and look at it on a macro level. We're going to look at it from the top to the bottom because I feel like there's a lot of people who are struggling in this process, and it's like they're lost in a forest they can't find their way out of. So it is my hopes that by giving you a macro perspective, you will be able to more easily find your way out of that forest. So let's go ahead. We're going to do this in a few parts. First, I want to kind of do an overview of everything, and then I want to go ahead and show you some of the basic features that are responsible for both sound production and sound modification. This is my simplified model of voice alteration, and this is a reduced model. Of course, there are more dimensions to voice than just this, but I think this is the simplest, most complete reduction of the process that you can basically get. This will basically cover all the bases with gender modification, and it will also include the primary things that we sort of want to have going on in the process. So I'm just going to go ahead and cover this up here, and we will get started and sort of fill this in as we go. At the very top of this entire puzzle, it all rests upon awareness. Awareness is the fundamental skill we should always be working to improve. Awareness is the input that makes possible changing any behavior. In voice alteration, awareness gained anywhere is a victory. Awareness over small muscle groups, awareness over what to do, awareness over what not to do, awareness that you're ready to start actually practicing. There are literally so many things that you can be aware of, and anytime you're aware of anything further, that is actually a victory in your practice. Please don't underestimate awareness. I know it sounds like marketing buzzwords, but I swear it's not. This entire process is all about gaining awareness of your body. Okay, so there are really two critical supporting components in this process. We have knowledge and we have mentality. Both of these form critical feedback loops that support the actions that you take and also support the entire holistic process occurring. So knowledge gives you a backbone for your actions, and it allows you to understand what you are doing. Mentality gives you the willpower and courage to take action. Knowledge is also very, very critical because it essentially loops all the way down through the process, allowing for reflection. And if we take conscious thought in that reflection and integrate it into our process, it feeds back into awareness and ultimately increases our action better. Okay, so in terms of mentality, this is so important. Maintaining a positive and productive mentality is absolutely crucial to consistent growth in anything. Mentality is the first and quickest element that directly feeds back into your awareness. And if you have a negative mentality, it reduces your awareness of the process, which ultimately reduces the clarity of thought and erodes away at your knowledge. It reduces and cripples the action that you take, and it immediately feeds back into itself, causing more negative mentality, less awareness, less clarity of thought, and less clarity of action. You must not underestimate the power of mentality in this process. The negative feedback loop that is formed from having a bad mentality can cripple the entire process. You have to have a good mentality. This is not a question of if you'll be able to feminize your voice. It is a question of when you will feminize your voice. And you need to internalize that so that you don't feel like you're in a crisis every time you go to practice. Okay, so now that we've talked about knowledge and we've talked about mentality, we can use awareness to directly take action. And the actions that we take in voice feminization or voice alteration of any kind can essentially be divided into two primary categories: sound production behaviors and sound modification behaviors. Okay, that is to say, there are things that we do in this process that are all about how we actually produce sound. And then there are things in this process that are all about how we modify the sound that we produce. Now, we consider these to be glottal behaviors. The glottis is a fancy word that means the vocal folds and the airway between them. So this essentially means the behaviors and actions that you can take with your vocal folds and those surrounding tissues that actually produce sound. And sound modification is resonance behavior, behaviors that you take with the vocal tract that alter the resonant qualities of the body. Okay, so in terms of sound production behaviors, this refers to everything that our vocal folds do. So there's a few different behaviors that we have with our vocal folds. We can change the pitch, of course, ah, up and down. Pitch refers to how fast the vocal folds actually vibrate, and it's controlled by the sort of vertical tension of the vocal folds. So when they're moving like this, if they stretch a lot tighter, they'll move faster. It's minimally important for voice feminization, but it is valuable for us to change our pitch. We also include pitch contour under this umbrella, so the actual movements of your pitch when you speak are counted as pitch, which is counted as glottal behavior. So another glottal parameter that we can control is what register we are in. So these are like different modes or states of vibration that your vocal folds can do. We have 4 of these. I'll go ahead and demonstrate them all. So our first one is glottal fry. Ah, it's like a creaky, croaky sound. Our second one is what we call our modal voice. That's what I'm speaking to you in right now. Ah, it's like that fuller voice. And then we have falsetto. So this is a falsetto. So this is also a falsetto. So we can do a lot with that one, but it's not super useful for general trans voice application. And we have one more, which is kind of fancy. Check it out. Okay, so far we have 2 glottal behaviors. We have pitch and we have register. Those 2 things are not super important for voice feminization. Now, we can also control the degree of adduction or abduction. So this refers to how closed or open the vocal folds are. Increasing adduction sounds a little bit like this. I'm just sort of squeezing the vocal folds, right? And increasing abduction sounds like this. Okay, so that is vocal fold closure, and it can go 2 ways, adduction or abduction. We can also control the rate of air, and we do that with our lungs. Now, of course, the lungs aren't your vocal folds, but we want to factor in this force of lung compression into glottal behavior simply because it allows for a much easier model, okay? So we can blow air fast, or we can blow air slow. Okay. So this last one is super important. This is the most important glottal behavior for vocal feminization. This is vocal fold mass or thickness or thinness. So we can actually use our body in a way that allows our vocal folds to vibrate with less mass or more mass. If we do more mass, it sounds much more masculine. If we do less mass, it sounds much more feminine. Let me go ahead and give you a demonstration. So here is thick versus thin with the same resonance. Ha, heat from fire, versus ha, ha, heat from fire, heat from fire, ha, heat from fire. I'll give you another example of thick versus thin. So I'm going to go into male pitch and male resonance, but I'll use very thin vocal folds.
Okay, so here I am. I've got masculine pitch, and I've got masculine resonance, but my vocal folds are very thin, so I don't really sound that masculine. In order to masculinize the voice, I will need to make my vocal folds thicker, which is very hard for me to do these days, okay? But that is what the sound of thickness and thinness is. It is a primary sex characteristic of voices, and it is the second most important thing next to your R1. Okay, so those are the 5 glottal parameters that I want you to focus on for now. We've got pitch, we've got register, we've got closure, we've got force of air, and we've got vocal fold mass, okay? Those are your 5 main parameters when you are dealing with sound production.
Now, when we look at resonance, there are a few primary parameters. Generally speaking, we can reduce all of this to either R1, R2, or R3. And of course, there are a lot of individual actions that can contribute to these different resonance values, but mostly we track them as an expression of R1 and R2. So I'll go ahead and modify my R1 for you so you can hear that. That refers to all the space within my throat. I released a video on this just recently, so go check that out if you haven't. So here we go.
Okay, so, I've got a much, lower R1 right now, and I'm just going to
slowly start to shrink the vocal tract a little bit. So that's what a raising R1 sounds like. Now, okay, so I've just lowered my R2. So this is like a very low R2, but my R1 is still high. So I'm just going to slowly start to make my R2 smaller. So like while I'm talking to you, my mouth is getting littler. Okay, so those are the effects of R1 and R2. R1 and R2 are the primary resonant frequencies of our voice, and they are the main things that we deal with when we deal with sound modification. We can change the value of these resonant frequencies with lots of different movements. R1 typically involves raising the larynx, changing the way that the root of the tongue is positioned, changing the dorsal position of the tongue, changing the oropharynx, changing some of the nasopharynx positioning. And then when we're dealing with R2, this more so deals with the location of articulation and the overall behaviors of the tongue when we're moving between sounds such as approximants or diphthongs. So I hope this little overview of sound production and sound modification is helpful for you. Hopefully you can start to see the differences between these two categories of action. Everything that I do in sound production directly influences the way the sound is created, and everything I'm doing with resonance directly influences the way the sound is modified. Okay, so without further ado, let's take a look at the actual variables that I think you should focus on for voice feminization. We have 4 of them, and the ones in the center are much more important than the ones on the outside. The ones on the outside here can be thought of as stylistic, aesthetic qualities primarily, and the ones in the center are the strongest elements that express the vocal sex of a speaker. In terms of sound modification, R1 is the most important value here, and this is correlated to the size of the pharynx and the geometry of the pharynx, okay? So if we modify the height of the larynx, if we modify the oropharynx, if we start to change different behaviors in the back with the tongue, all of this stuff changes the geometry of the pharynx, which ultimately alters R1, which is ultimately one of the primary keys that feed into your output, okay? Now, the other primary sex characteristic for sound production is vocal fold thickness, okay? This creates a perceptual effect of what is called spectral tilt or spectral roll-off. The thickness of the vocal folds plus R1 are the 2 most powerful variables that feed into the gender of somebody's voice. If we are going to change a voice, we want to think about R1 as the primary sound modification and a resonance behavior that we have to do. And we want to think about reducing vocal fold thickness as the primary sound production and glottal behavior that we want to master, okay? Now on the outsides here, I also have pitch that feeds into this. I consider pitch much more a stylistic element, but there is definitely somewhat of a gender component here, especially when you factor in pitch contour and the actual way that pitch behaves when speakers are talking. And then we have R2 here, which refers to the behavior inside the oral cavity, where the articulation of consonants occur, how the behavior of diphthongs and approximants are executed, and so on and so forth. This element is also important for gender. However, it strongly shares a relationship with R1. So typically when we raise our R1, we also shrink this in the process. However, we can still stylize and accessorize and customize the voice with R2 behaviors, and they do contribute a strong deal of gender perception. These 4 primary things in this process essentially feed together and sum, creating your output. With this output, you have immediate initial hearing and proprioception, which is the actual feeling of what you're doing. Now, this output immediately feeds back up our feedback line into awareness, okay? So we can choose to pay attention to this proprioceptive experience of how the thing feels, and we can pay attention to our initial hearing. By taking even greater awareness And by feeding in knowledge, we can create reflection, and through conscious thought, that reflection can supersede our initial experience of the output and create a much more meaningful experience when we practice. So this is the overall view that I think you should have for this process. Awareness is the input. We have knowledge and mentality as supporting characters that feed back into the overall awareness of the process. We can take direct action, and the actions that we take classify into two primary categories: sound production behaviors and sound modification behaviors. The primary variable from sound production that influences gender perception is vocal fold thickness or thinness. This creates a perception of spectral roll-off or spectral tilt, which is very gendered. And then the primary element of sound modification that we care about is the alteration of the pharynx space, which ultimately changes R1. So these two are most important. These other two boxes here, like I said, are stylistic. You can also bring the pitch up, which is certainly welcome, not necessary. Pitch should be seen as stylistic. Lower pitches with thin vocal folds and a high R1 will just tend to sound more butch. So if you're looking for a butch femme vibe, that's where you're going to want to go. And then R2 stuff can also change the aesthetic of what we're doing by modifying the oral cavity. These qualities sum together to produce an output, which you immediately get some feeling of and some sound of, which ultimately goes up into your awareness. With conscious thought, we can take this one level deeper with knowledge and reflect, which creates an even stronger feedback loop up into awareness. And ultimately at the end here, we have two primary tasks that we are left with: refinement and normalization. So I want to take a moment and just talk about refinement and normalization. This could be its own entire flowchart, but to save space in our brains, let's just compartmentalize it a little bit more, okay? So first off, to refine your voice, you need to identify what it is you want to do with your voice. You should try to find vocal models or vocal goals that inspire you or you are connected to. It can be very helpful to create a list of a few voices that really speak to you. And even if you don't want those voices in particular, you can comb through the voices and have someone, me or some other professional, or even yourself once you gain enough knowledge, go through and figure out the stylistic trends that are emerging in those vocal models. So if you pick 5 voices, yeah, they're probably all going to be different, but you like them all. Chances are there are some trends and stylistic consistencies between what you picked. So what you try and do is you try and get those qualities into your voice, isolate and identify what it is that you actually like about those general voices, and start to employ that in your voice. Now, refinement is also something that happens naturally. If you're not 100% satisfied with where your voice is, if you talk in it every day for the next 6 months, it's probably going to change a little bit. I won't necessarily say you'll end up loving the end result, but it will definitely change. And oftentimes that's the refinement that needs to be done. Behavioral refinement. It's not a technique kind of refinement. There are really 2 types of refinement, or possibly more, that you can explore: behavioral refinement and technique refinement. Technique refinement is the pure theoretical ability to control your vocal tract and create the right sound in isolated moments in your practice. Behavioral refinement is where you then start to integrate that throughout your day-to-day life and try to normalize that behavior. The normalization of a behavior is very simple. You will have the tendency to drift back to your old behaviors, to your old average, okay? I call this a gravity of habit. Essentially, to normalize a behavior, every time you fall back and catch yourself falling back, you have to correct yourself. And if you start to fall back right after, that's fine. Correct yourself again. If you eventually exhaust the mental energy to continuously keep correcting yourself, that's okay too. It's a process that takes time. Whenever you catch yourself drifting back to your old gravity, we try to recenter yourself back on what you want and maintain that for as long as you can. At first, for probably a while, it will be very frustrating because it will seem like no matter what you do, you keep returning to your old voice, okay? This is extremely normal. In fact, this will happen until the desired behavior that you're trying to make it become a habit at least fires with 51% probability, Okay? So until you accidentally do what you want more than half the time, you have to manually and consciously constantly recorrect yourself. Okay? And what that does is it builds up weight and it builds up this behavioral momentum so that once you actually cross that 50% mark and now you're doing the desired behavior 51% of the time, it becomes self-sustaining at that time, okay? So you shouldn't view it as you're trying to normalize your voice constantly to 100% perfection right off the bat. It should be you're trying to reset yourself whenever you mess up or whenever you drift back as much as you can, and over time, the desired behavior will start to emerge as a higher probability behavior. At the point where it crosses over 50%, I call that a behavioral inversion. And at that point, it becomes the predominant behavior. So it gains inertia and essentially completes itself to 100%. Okay, now there are so many different strategies that we can use for refinement and normalization, but that is way too much to cover in this overview video that I want to make today. In conclusion, I hope you have a better understanding of the entire complete process of voice feminization. I don't want anyone who watches my channel to over-focus on any particular element. Resonance is extremely important. However, sound production is also very important. So is having a good mental outlook. So is having good information. So is experimentation. So is taking care of your body and hydrating and taking it easy when you practice. All of these things are important, and you need to execute on all of them in order to reach your goals in the fastest and most effective way. So thank you all so much for watching. If you have any questions or comments, please post them below. You know I read everything. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video if you found it helpful. And check out my work on Patreon if you would like to support me. And of course, if you'd like to work together in private lessons, please just email transvoicelessons@gmail.com. And otherwise, love you all so much and thank you for everything as always. Bye.